Well, welcome into another episode of the Story World Podcast. Steve Schramm here with my boy Al. What's up, Al?
How you doing, Steve? I wish that people could see our little warm up beforehand. It gets a little crazy going as we record podcast episodes.
Yeah, you know what? We should start. Like I said, remember how I said like the first 30 seconds are like what's supposed to hook people? We should just always hook people with a blooper reel from our warm up.
I agree.
Right?
It's always good.
Get into it. Hey, did you see the latest comment on our YouTube channel?
I didn't.
It's really.
I don't know how to read it aloud. Read it aloud.
I don't know how to feel about it. I hope this person, whoever it is watching. Do you have it in front of you? You want to read it for us?
So,
read it for the audience.
It's public, so I'll say the person's username too. If you're watching.
Oh, go for it. Go for it.
Jeannie, I want to say it's Jeannie. Jeannie B5218. I'm curious if Steve does cartoon voiceover with the emoji. If he doesn't, he could.
I'm not sure whether to cry, to be angry, or to start a business. I'm really not sure which one. Historically, I start businesses.
Appropriate was on the Michael Heiser podcast, so those two subjects relate very well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Steve, maybe you have another calling there. Yeah, that's it.
I can't believe it. I have never considered that. Well, Jeannie 5218-607-9425, whoever you are, I have never done cartoon voiceovers, and I'm not sure how I feel about your comment. But if you meant it as a compliment, then thank you. If you didn't, then I don't know how I can help you. I'm terribly sorry. You'll be the first to know if I decide to go down that career path. Maybe I have found my calling. So fun stuff.
If you fail at being a cartoon voiceover, perhaps you could do puppeteering. So
puppeteering, ventriloquism and all that.
Yes,
yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
I've learned how to throw my voice, my annoying cartoon voice, into other places.
Sure,
absolutely.
Line of work. Have you? We are going down rabbit trails already at the beginning, but that's okay. So, are you familiar with the Dark Crystal movie as well as the new series on Netflix? I say it's new; it's like 3 years old now.
Dark Crystal? No.
I was almost going to say it's a cartoon, but it's not. And they probably use some CGI for things, but it's mostly, you have to look it up. It's a fantasy thing, but they use puppets and it's set in a fantasy world. It's one of my favorite, movies and shows. And it's incredible. The amount of work that goes into it.
I actually think you told me about this. I think you might have showed me this before now that you mentioned it.
You don't even have to watch the show if you just look up, the Dark Crystal Netflix show behind the scenes, it's incredible.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Have to check that out.
Anyway, so what is our topic for tonight, Steve? Let's get on track.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are on the third episode now of our series on the parables. And in this one, we're talking about the parable of the mustard seed. And just like a mustard seed, this is one of the shorter parables that we have, one of the smaller ones in the Bible. And so still, even though it is a small parable, like the mustard seed, it packs a big punch like the mustard tree. I'm not sure how much further I can carry this. So I'm going to turn it back over to you and hopefully you can rescue it.
No, that sounds good. So it's only 2 verses. I encourage you though to read the whole chapter. It's actually a really interesting chapter. I'm not going to count them, but I don't know, 4 or so parables, maybe 4 or 5 parables in this chapter. But we're just going to take the 2 verses that deal with the mustard seed in Matthew 13 verses 31 and 32. It says, he, talking about Jesus, presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but when grown, it's taller than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the sky come and nest in its branches. And that is the parable of the mustard seed. Very small, neat, and tidy.
Alex, my goodness, Alex, this disproves the entire Bible. Do you know that the Bible is not true? Because Jesus, the Son of God, ought to know that the mustard seed is not actually the smallest of all seeds. Alex, how answer you? God isn't real. Jesus isn't real. The mustard seed is not the smallest of all seeds. What do you say to this challenge?
Yeah. It is probably the greatest challenge to the Bible that I have ever heard. And it's all
forget the problem of evil. Have you heard about the mustard seed?
Yeah, forget the problem of evil and all that. It's really what comes out of the mustard seed. Yeah, so I gotta for anyone who actually is, there might be people who actually are like, hey, well, what is the answer to that? It is kind of weird how he said it's the smallest seed, but of course it's not. There's a couple different answers for it. I'll get mine, Steve. Maybe you have a different take on it. I like one example, is that like for that time, I'm not a historian or anything. So, but for that time, the mustard seed was the smallest seed, that the people in that area or general vicinity actually like farmed to grow things. And so
Yeah.
in the verse it says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds. So from the fields that were grown, whenever they grew in that time in that area, the mustard seed would be the smallest seed that they would actually plant and grow with. So just a simple explanation. I think that probably is the explanation, but I'm sure there's others if you have it.
Yeah. No, 100%. No, that definitely is the most immediate, contextually appropriate explanation. There's another one that I'll go into here in just a second, but just a point. I know I was being a little bit facetious earlier, but there really are people who make claims like that, right?
Yep.
And so I thought while we're on this parable, it might be an instructive point to just kind of point this out. Like there really are people who make the claim as atheists that, well, we can't trust the Bible because X, Y, Z, and they'll give more than this, but this is one of the things they'll point to. They'll say, well, Jesus is supposed to be God in the flesh, the Son of God, and here he is talking about, he ought to know the smallest of all seeds is not the mustard seed, and so what do you do with that? And similarly, there are people who compare God to Santa Claus and kind of make that, that sort of, well, if one's not real, then the other's not real and all of that. And I'm like, okay, well, first of all, like we need to slow down and actually think about what we're saying. Number one, the other explanation that I would give is that Jesus is not doing botany here in this passage.
Right.
Okay. He may be the Son of God, but he was not a botanist, and he was not trying to do botany, right? He's not trying to go in and actually make an examination. It's kind of like the writer of Genesis who mentions a snake in the garden. The snake is a divine being. Okay. He's not doing biology. He's not trying to comment on the physical nature of snakes in that case. He is pointing to something beyond that. And so the same with this, Jesus is making a practical and theological point, and he's making it in a way that they would understand in the context that they are actually in.
And even take away the historicity of it, take away that, let's just say there were no mustard seeds planted at that time. Let's just say it seems completely random they used the mustard seed at it. There is also a thing called like hyperbole. And like, if you apply the same standard to this, everyone would be a liar when you say it's raining cats and dogs, that it was the biggest mountain you've ever seen, when there's maybe you've seen dozens of more. I mean, there's just so many different ways where this just, I guess you can call it an argument, just falls flat.
Yeah, I think it's called hyperbole.
Did I say hyperbole? Hyperbole. No, you're right.
I am forever going to call it hyperbole from now on.
It is 100% hyperbole. My brain had a dysfunction. Yeah.
Hyperbole. No, it's all good. Hyperbole. It's so great. Like when I had a bowl cut back when I had hair, I feel like that's what people look like. They called that the hyperbole. I feel like.
I don't know. You had hair?
I did.
I don't know what it's called. I actually, my wife will laugh at me sometimes for it. I will pronounce words super weird sometimes, even though I know the right way. And yeah. I think I don't know if there's a word for it. If there is, I want someone to comment and tell me, but I will say words sometimes that make people look at me, just go really weird. I don't know if there's a weird disconnect there, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think one more thing that I'd actually like to mention about this is that, again, beyond like the practical considerations, like something like hyperbole, and then beyond like the historical context, like maybe you didn't know anything about ancient, Israel, and it's like, okay, well, I don't know what they believed back then, and so maybe you're not even thinking in those terms. Again, if you just read the text, that's a whole other layer of that, where it's like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all that seeds, but when grown, it's taller than the garden plants and becomes like a tree. So again, it's very much just read the text and look at the verse in its context. And in this case, the verse itself sort of gives you the explanation of what Jesus is talking about. So yeah, he's not doing botany. It's historically accurate to what they would have believed and thought based on where they were in history and like their immediate context around them. And then also, yeah, if you just look at the text of the verse, the context makes sense. Also, and I know we're kind of rabbit holing here down like an apologetics trail real quick, but
It's fun.
I like this because that's something that me and Alex are both passionate about as well. Believe it or not, I actually think this goes further than not presenting a challenge for the Bible. I actually think this strengthens the biblical witness. And you might wonder, well, how is that, Steve? And I'm glad you asked, because it tells us and it confirms what is happening in other areas as well. It confirms that the biblical writer is writing from the perspective of what information and knowledge is immediately available to them to work with based on their observations. And so we call this phenomenology, okay? Phenomenology. And it's the idea of basically writing things as you see them, of being the observer in a situation. So the observer in this situation, or the observers in this situation, noticed a seed that was smaller than all of the others, and it was the mustard seed. Okay? That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing, because the Bible is not trying to do science. Such an important point. The Bible is a historical book. It's a theological book. It is not a science textbook, even if it makes statements that about a particular history that may lend itself to have scientific implications. For example, I am a young earth, young age creationist, not an old age creationist, so I don't believe that a Big Bang happened 13.8 billion years ago. And so you're like, well, where do you get that from? Well, I think you can get there from the Bible, but that's a different topic for a different day. And that may have implications for how we understand things about science, but that it doesn't mean that the Bible is doing science ever at any point. It's not what the Bible is trying to do. And so same thing is true here. When you see something written from the perspective of an observer, it's not trying to do science. Just to make it make a little more sense for you, consider Joshua chapter 10. Now, this is the famous passage in Joshua where they're fighting, and a statement is made where the sun stood still. Well, geocentrists have tried to argue for centuries now that the Bible is actually a geocentric document, right? Because it affirms this position, and it would be impossible in a heliocentric model for the sun to stand still. Like, we know that's not how the solar system works. And so, don't you see, the Bible teaches geocentrism? Well, again, it doesn't teach geocentrism. If you look from the perspective of the observer on Earth and you see what is happening, and what happened in the sky was that the sun stayed in the same spot for a longer period of time than normal. And that is an observer-centric thing. That's what the observer saw. It's not making a statement about the physicality of how that happened. God can do miraculous things. Did he sort of suspend the rotation of the soul? I have no idea. I'm not speculating on that. And neither is the Bible. It's just writing from the perspective of the observer. And so that use of phenomenology is helpful in many different cases to understand what their concerns were and what they were seeing and what they were doing. And so this tiny little parable is actually very instructive about a lot of interesting things that people often get wrong about trying to interpret and understand God's word.
It is good. Just kind of reiterating what you're saying, but it is important to know that just because a verse says something in the Bible, it does not mean you can extrapolate this thing that we learned in biology or in geology, in the last 50 or 100 years. And this is exactly what it's saying. Because like what Steve said, it's literally a perspective of, hey, this is what happened, at least to the perspective of the observer. This is what they're looking at. And here's what happened in the story. Very good words there, Steve.
Yeah, it's insightful. So, how about you maybe, since I've talked for a while, maybe we have this little description written out. Maybe you just kind of read a description of what the parable is trying to say, in plain words, and then we'll talk through some of the points, and then wrap this one up.
Yep, I think that sounds good. It's funny that the actual mustard seed part probably take up at least half of this podcast episode, but I think it's a very important aspect. The actual, I guess, meaning or purpose of the mustard seed. So, in the parable of the mustard seed, Jesus uses the imagery of a tiny mustard seed to illustrate the kingdom of heaven's nature and growth. He describes the mustard seed as the smallest of all seeds, yet when planted, it grows into a large tree where birds come and find shelter in its branches. The simplicity of this analogy carries profound implications about the nature of faith, growth, and the expansive reach of God's kingdom. The mustard seed, despite its diminutive size, possesses the potential to grow into a great tree, providing not just physical growth, but also haven for creatures. Similar, the kingdom of heaven starts small, maybe even inconspicuous, but its influence grows to encompass it to provide refuge for many. It's what's interesting about that description is I've always, whenever I've read this parable, I've always taken it as, okay, the kingdom of God, starts out small, which just makes sense. You just look at not even the Old Testament, but looking at where Jesus started the church in the New Testament. Obviously, it started small, started literally with Jesus, and then it grew to the apostles, and then followers, and then grow and grow. I never really looked at the analogy of birds resting in it and being like kind of having that safe haven picture that always just kind of escaped me. So I think that's kind of an interesting perspective that I never looked at before.
Yeah, right. Like, and consider, it's interesting because this parable is not necessarily trying to do prophecy, and yet it's somewhat prophetic in nature if you think about it, right? Because of that piece of it. The kingdom of heaven obviously started out very small, and I think there's an even larger point that we should probably go into just about God usually uses small things and makes them into great and mighty things. But in this case specifically, we're talking about the kingdom of heaven, which the kingdom of heaven, this is another point where there has been lots of theological debate. What's the kingdom of heaven? What's the kingdom of God? Are they the same thing? Are they different things? And your hardcore, like, dispensationalist types are going to want to say that they're different things, whereas more covenantalist types are going to want to say that they're the same thing, just using different language. I don't really want to comment on that here, mostly because I don't really have an opinion on this. I don't have a document. And I need to do more study on it myself to kind of know where I would land from a more thoughtful point of view. But what's interesting is that no doubt the kingdom of heaven started small, and we know that the Christian faith actually grew in spite of immense persecution. It's really interesting because, like, the primary persecutor of Christians in the early days was the Roman Empire, and now, like, you literally have Roman Catholicism, like, in just a few hundred years' time.
It's crazy.
Yeah, like, Christianity overtook Rome. Really crazy to think about. And then if you just sort of extend that prophetically, and you look at over the millennia what Christianity has done, I mean, not only just in terms of like bringing salvation and hope and restoration to the world, but even if you get into the practical details and nuance of rescue programs like the Salvation Army and Samaritan's Purse and things that have been done in the name of Christ for widows and children and in the sex trafficking world, and just all these things. Sure, we're not going to ignore that there were things and acts committed over the millennia in the name of Christ that were not something that Christ would agree with. But in large measure, that's not the case. In large measure, this is why you have Baptist and Methodist and Presbyterian hospitals. Like, a lot of the goodwill and giving back and social causes, all of those things, like, grew out of a Christian worldview. And so it's really interesting to see that the kingdom of heaven, which started really small, has now grown into this large mustard tree that has actually provided covering and that protection for many, many people over the millennia, billions of people. Really amazing to see how that happened.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, it's not just the tree itself is a bunch of churches with Christians in them, but the tree itself really encompasses, like what you're saying, like mankind, and you can see its reaches through everything in life, and it's really miraculous. Like what you were just saying, it didn't take very long for it to permeate throughout the Roman Empire, and it's insane how quick it spread.
Yeah, and like, again, this is Jesus not doing prophecy and yet doing prophecy, right? Yeah. I mean, this is Jesus saying, like, this is how the thing is, and this is how it works. Now we get the benefit of hindsight. I mean, these words were spoken 2,000 plus years ago, and now in hindsight, we're looking back and we're seeing, oh my goodness, that happened, right?
Yeah,
he said that, and it happened.
Steve and I are going to do a podcast later on about what Jesus had to say about the parables that he spoke, but just to touch on it very little, you almost put yourself in the apostles' shoes and what was crossing their mind when they heard that. Because they
Yeah,
even couldn't really they didn't comprehend when Jesus died. That was a real big blow to them. And that was something that even like Jesus like predicted himself. And
exactly.
they were still shocked by it. So something like this, I just wonder what went through their minds. I mean, even if they grasped what Jesus was saying to them, they just I just think that they were limited in what they could really see and picture growing to be.
Well, yeah, and like obviously in the context of this passage, like there's literally where you're at the point, kind of like the high point really in Jesus's ministry, right? Where you've got crowds of people following him and maybe they could start to see it like getting some traction. Like,
Mhm.
maybe there's something here. But then certainly after the crucifixion and everything, it's like, oh, well, so much for that kingdom of heaven. But then of course he comes back, he ascends, the spirit descends, 3,000 people
Right.
get saved at Pentecost, and it's on like Donkey Kong, right? And then
Yeah.
the influence
That's
starts to spread.
that's what they
And
said.
even I bet they
They
did.
were
Um,
just a Donkey Kong, ladies and gentlemen.
Do Donkey Kong was prophecy too. And so, and so they really got to see that happening in real time. And even though it took centuries for that persecution to like let up, of course, there's still persecution. And Christian persecution is a real thing. People persecuting Christians and literally being killed every single day all across the world. That's definitely still a thing. But like the fact that it became like the official religion of the place where it was primarily like the punishment was primarily coming down from is really insane. So anyway, I think for the sake of time, I really just have one kind of main big takeaway. I think that I'd like to kind of go through with this, and we can kind of toss back and forth. And maybe you say something about this first, but the kind of direction that I think um like what this parable is really teaching is that God is able to do a lot with a little. And I see this all throughout the Old Testament. Israel itself is a small, seemingly insignificant nation that, because of what God had intended for it and his plan for it through Abraham, we have all become the book of Galatians says that we are, if we're in Christ, that we have all become the seed of Abraham. Some of my lights turned off. Anyway, I'll turn them back on in a minute. But we have all become the seed of Abraham. So literally through this insignificant little nation of Israel, God has provided bountifully and blessed and provided a covering for people. I think of King David, the little shepherd boy. I think of Gideon, an insignificant man who had gathered this huge army, and God's like, yeah, that's not going to work, and strips down his army to 300 people. And then, I mean, God is just in the habit of using small things and making them big instead of
Mhm.
using the bigger things in the world. And I just think that's such a beautiful thing that this parable sort of condenses down and illustrates well.
Yeah, small in numbers, examples you gave, and even Israel as a nation. Obviously there's millions of Jews, but like comparatively to a lot of other nations, they're small in comparison still relatively, and it's been like that like forever. And yeah, so that's a good example. Another thing that I kind of want to pull from it too is just so obviously spiritually in your whole life and where you're at in your growth, and what you want to do maybe as a ministry, but even applicable to raising a family, starting a business, or doing anything in life, this pattern kind of applies to everything. How you don't just get $1 million. Well, some people do. You don't just get $1 million and just go at it and be successful. Yeah, that's skipping a lot of steps. Usually it's something that starts small, whether it's you're trying to start that business or you're trying to save a college fund for your kid, or you're trying to, have a plan for teaching them a work ethic. It usually follows a progression of starting small and then it grows. And then in the end, you kind of reap the rewards from it, and it provides that shelter that's talked about there.
Yeah, it's very true. And as you were saying that actually prompted a really interesting thought that kind of like circles us almost back around to the apologetics a little bit. Because someone might want to say, well, okay, if this is sort of like a universally true principle, then maybe he wasn't doing prophecy. Maybe he was just saying something that's intuitively obvious. And so someone might want to point to, say, the religion of Islam or something and say, well, Islam started out small and now it's growing and it's this huge thing. And so why doesn't this parable apply to Islam as well? And I think you can sort of look at the details of how Islam grew versus how Christianity grew and sort of get some insight into how this works. Now, of course, it is sort of a general principle. Things typically do start small and get larger. So in that sense, yeah, okay, fine. It is sort of a general principle. But certainly if you look at the details, again, it's certainly not true that with Islam, like people were basically just led peacefully through the comfort of like being able to accept this and like now they can find nesting in its branches and all that. Islam very obviously grew by the sword. And yes, there were periods of in Christian, especially with the Spanish Inquisition and stuff like that, there were like isolated pockets of people who did violent things in the name of Christ that he would have never, ever endorsed. But that's very relatively small when you're talking about the billions of people who have come to Christ over the years. And being grown and spread as truly a religion of submission and of peace and of turn the other cheek and of actually living into the principles that Jesus taught instead of being manipulated and being, forced into belief by the sword and all of that. So, yeah, you can look at it in specific instances, I think, and sort of get around that. But certainly it's true that Jesus was talking about a general principle here. It's definitely proved true with Christianity, I think, more so than anything else.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. And specifically, I know you kind of apply it to the general, but when you do get back to the specifics of it, because someone might say, okay, well, there's other churches that have grown big. Obviously Islam is number one, but even other things. And it kind of applies. It kind of goes into the weeds a little bit with sometimes we see people who are doing bad that have like successful lights, and we see how come those people are doing well and these people aren't. Well, again, kind of taking it back to what Christ is actually saying. He never says in these two verses that other false religions will not grow strong or powerful. Right. He's not even, he never rules out anything like bad happening in life. He is literally focused on one thing. And the one thing is, hey, this kingdom, my kingdom is going to grow. Mm-hmm. So just because other kingdoms might come and go, good, bad, evil, the main promise is that his is going to grow. And obviously it has, like what you just said.
Yeah. Sure. And again, this is why the Bible is so cool, because if you're looking at this again in the historical context of when it was written, there were other people. Jesus was not the only one. Mm-hmm. There were other people who were claiming to be Messiah figures to the Jewish people. And who are they? You don't even know their names, right? You've never heard of them before. And so, in fact, that is one of the primary, like the traditional Orthodox Jewish response to the question of, okay, well, who was Jesus? Is that he was just a Jewish rabbi who ended up being a failed Messiah, right? Who claimed to be a Messiah and actually was not the Messiah. And why do they believe that? Well, because they were crucified at the hands of the Jewish people, and obviously they were making excuses even as early as the resurrection. Oh, well, the Jews must have stolen the body, or the Romans must have stolen the body, et cetera, or not the Romans, the disciples must have stolen the body. I'm going to learn how to talk tonight. And so they were literally making excuses for this whole thing from the very beginning. And so no slight against my like, I love you if you're Jewish, but it's like the Orthodox Jewish position, I'm just saying, is that Jesus was a failed Messiah figure who was a very influential rabbi. And it's like, well, clearly he wasn't. Certainly he accomplished something, because billions of people have gotten saved over the years and claimed the name of Christ. And yet these other supposedly failed Messiah figures, you don't even know who they are. And so it's definitely significant that in his context, he certainly outlasted those claims. And he was right about Christianity.
Yeah, well said, Steve. I don't think I really have anything else. That's kind of all my thoughts on it, as long as you're good.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go to stories of the week, and I'll let you go first.
Perfect. Have you ever heard or seen the movie 12 Angry Men?
I have not.
It's been on my list for a long time. I think it came out in, I'm not box the year, it's either like 58 or 68 or something, but it's an old movie. It's black and white. I think it's in the late 50s. Anyway, it's, I don't have the description up, but basically it's a relatively short movie, 80 some minutes, I think. It's about a court case where a boy I don't know if he's I forget if he's black or Mexican or Indian, but he's got darker skin color, and he's on trial for murder. You don't really see much of the court case. You see the jurors going into the back room, and it's about these 12 men, and going around the first table the first time, 11 of them say that he's guilty pretty quickly, but one guy holds out. And the whole movie is about just trying to convince everyone that this kid is maybe not innocent, but definitely not guilty. And it's a really good movie. If you look it up I've been wanting to watch a while, because if you look up on IMDb, it's like it's in the top 10 movies like ever made. It's got a super high thing, and it's noted for being one of the best movies ever made. So I said, well, something's got to be good with it. And it is very good. And after doing some research afterwards, just because even though I appreciate film and I'm a huge movie fan, I'm obviously not a director, or, I don't know film like other people. And so it's interesting seeing the notes of how it was filmed certain ways throughout the movie to give like the perspective of it and of different things. So anyway, definitely well worth going to check out. It's a great movie.
Cool. Awesome. I feel like this time we actually have real stories of the week. Like they're actual stories.
Real thing.
Real stories, just whatever's going on. So that's kind of cool. Awesome. Well, I will have to check that out. Although I have to admit, I have a hard time with old movies. Like I can't even bring myself to watch the Star Trek, like the original Star Trek series, even though I'm a huge Star Trek fan.
I was hesitant about 12 Angry Men, because I will admit, I sometimes I've watched an old movie with the intention, okay, I'm definitely going to like this, and it just doesn't age well. This one has aged quite well. There's obviously moments where the emotions get high super quick, and it's kind of typical back then. But other than that, it's very good. I was very impressed. Sorry, keep going.
Okay. No, you're good. No, that's perfect. Cool. We'll check it out. Okay, so for me, I read a book this week. I read it in 2 nights, which has never happened before. This was definitely so. Again, some of you guys, if you've been listening to the podcast, you would know that I am not historically a fiction guy. I have just ever since meeting Alex started getting into actually reading fiction and even watching more movies and stuff like that. And so my buddy Jared let me borrow this book called Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, and it is just fantastic. Like I said, I read it in 2 nights. Total thriller, page turner. I've never had a book sort of do that to me before. And I'm in the middle of reading some really, really good stuff right now. Reading the Terminal List by Jack Carr. I am reading Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. And I feel like I've got another one going on too. That's slipping my mind. Oh, I've got a book about called Noah, a Man of God, which is a historical fiction about Noah by Tim Chaffee. And so anyway, all those are great books, but this one I started it and I was like, I can't put this down. Really good book. The description, I do have that pulled up. I'm going to read just a little bit of it. Are you happy with your life? Those are the last words Jason Dessen hears before the masked abductor knocks him unconscious, before he awakens to find himself strapped to a gurney surrounded by strangers in hazmat suits. Before a man Jason's never met smiles down at him and says, "Welcome back, my friend." In this world he's woken up to, Jason's life is not the one he knows. His wife is not his wife. His son was never born. And Jason is not an ordinary college physics professor, but a celebrated genius who has achieved something remarkable, something impossible. And then it goes on and on and on. And so
that's intriguing. That description is great.
It is a fantastic description, and the book, it's just line after line after line. It just reels you in like you're on the end of a fishing line or something. It's really crazy. So fantastic book. Highly encourage you to read. The book is actually going to be coming out as an Apple TV Plus series. I hope soon. I think it was just greenlit officially last year sometime, or maybe even early this year, like April of this year. It might have been greenlit. So I'm sure it's still got a while to go before it reaches the masses as a TV series, but it is for sure happening. And so I'm really excited about that. But yeah, the book, absolutely fantastic. So it kept me going. It kept me going. Lots of twists and turns. Just really good. Awesome. So Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. Highly recommend it.
Cool. I think the most exciting thing about tonight is finding out that you might have a second career as a cartoon voiceover. So that's very exciting, Steve. I'm very happy about that.
I mean, I cannot wait to explore that. I feel like I need to go buy a web domain right now for that.
Oh, you got it.
As one does. And so, Yeah, no,
As,
it's good.
as Steve does.
As Steve does.
As,
As Steve does.
as
But it's
Steve
been a
does,
fun
so
one,
does
Alex.
Steve.
Yes, it's true.
Yeah, it's been fun. This was we talked more about this than I thought we would. A lot packed into that, two small horses there.
I'm telling you, it's kind of crazy. It was like a mustard seed that turned into a big giant tree, mighty tree. It was
One
amazing.
might say.
One
All
might
right,
say.
Steve. Good talking.
All right. All right, y'all be good. Share the podcast. Hide your kids, hide your wife, all that. We'll see y'all later.
See ya.